in the heart of New Orleans, where the Mississippi winds its way through a city of gaslit streets and crumbling mansions, there existed a woman whose beauty would become the subject of whispers and legends for generations. She was said to be unparalleled, her face the envy of aristocrats, her presence commanding yet elusive. But beauty in her case was only a fragment of the story. For Elena Reynolds was not simply admired. She was owned, sold, chained, and yet her story was one of defiance, cunning, and survival, hidden within the gilded corridors of a society built upon the suffering of human beings. The city of New Orleans in the early 19th century was a paradox. It gleamed with wealth, music, and opulence, yet beneath the veneer of high society, it was a city shackled to the cruel machinery of slavery. In this world, bloodlines determined fate and skin color dictated value. Elena, born to a mother of color and the disinherited son of a wealthy plantation owner, was thrust into this brutal hierarchy from her first breath. She existed as property, a living commodity, auctioned to the highest bidder, yet her mind, her spirit, and her determination were never theirs to claim. Her story begins on the auction block of the St. Louis Hotel, one of the city's grandest establishments, where families gathered to purchase both labor and social prestige. Bidders raised their hands with cold calculation, unaware that the woman they sought to claim would ultimately defy them all. The details of that day, frozen in the records of sales and newspapers, cannot capture the courage that flickered behind her eyes, the fire of survival that would come to define her life. But Elena was more than a beautiful face on the block. She possessed intelligence and resourcefulness that would soon make her a figure of fascination and fear. Her early years in captivity were marked by obedience, careful observation, and a quiet plotting that would later prove crucial. In a city where freedom was a distant dream for those of her status, she began to navigate the shadows of power, influence, and secrecy, learning the intricate networks that allowed some to wield control even under oppression. Then one day she vanished. Her disappearance was sudden, unannounced, leaving slaveholders, heirs, and overseers scrambling to locate her. Plantation records listed her as missing. Rewards were offered, searches conducted, and riverboats scoured for signs of her flight north. Yet all clues pointed to a woman who was determined to write her own destiny. She moved with care, avoiding the eyes of those who sought to claim her, blending into the bustling streets of New Orleans and the labyrinthine alleys of the French Quarter. For 3 years, her trail disappeared into shadows, leaving only fragments, a receipt from an apothecary, the mention of a voodoo priestess who sometimes sheltered fugitives, and the echoes of her resilience, whispered among those who had glimpsed her courage. When she reappeared, it was at a place and time that stunned the city. The annual Mardi Gras ball at the St. Louis Hotel, once the scene of her sale, now became the stage for her return. No longer a slave, no longer a mere spectator, she entered as an elegantly dressed companion to a powerful figure, Louis Villard. Witnesses recall gasps and silent glances, the momentary halt of conversation as the mysterious beauty passed through the ballroom. She wore midnight blue silk, a color that seemed to capture both the darkness of her past and the strength of her newfound freedom. Some historians speculate that she had gained leverage over her former oppressors through knowledge of hidden documents. Others suggest that Louis Villars had secretly purchased her freedom. What is certain is that her entrance represented a bold statement, a challenge to a society structured to control her very existence. The consequences of her return were swift. A rival, the once powerful Charles de Lacroix, attempted legal retaliation, but his claims were quietly withdrawn. Within days, Elena and Louis departed for Europe, leaving a trail of rumors and speculation. What occurred in the following weeks remains shrouded in mystery. The de Lacroix mansion on Royal Street, once a symbol of wealth and control, was abandoned in haste. Its occupants vanished. Servants carried trunks, yet left wardrobes filled and food in pantries, suggesting a departure planned with meticulous care. Soon after, the bodies of 2 men, the plantation manager and the family secretary, were discovered, execution style, in the swamp. The connection to Elena and Louis is inferred, yet direct evidence remained elusive for over a century. It would take decades for the pieces to emerge. In the 1960s, during renovations of the de Lacroix mansion, a hidden room was uncovered, containing Elena's journal, a concealed family portrait, and mysterious finger bones. The journal detailed her captivity, her daring escape, and her careful plotting to protect those she cared for. The portrait, painted over an image of her own family, suggested a reclamation of identity, a literal rewriting of history. Forensic experts later confirmed that the remains likely belonged to one of the executed men, revealing the brutal lengths to which her enemies, and perhaps her allies, had been dealt with. Letters discovered in family archives revealed private arrangements, legal settlements, and secret flights that ensured her survival and freedom. Yet the fate of the Delacroix children remains unknown, a haunting absence that underscores the costs of a society that treated humans as property. Elena Reynolds ultimately settled in Europe, living in London and later England, raising a family far removed from the horrors of New Orleans. She died at the age of 55, her legacy preserved through her journal, her portrait, and the artifacts that traced her journey. Yet the story does not end with her death. Her life stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the ingenuity required to survive an oppressive system, and the complex moral choices faced by those navigating a world built on injustice. Tonight, we uncover the bizarre mystery of the most beautiful slave in New Orleans history. This is a story of captivity and courage, of cunning and survival, of wealth and murder, of love and vengeance. It is a story where a single woman challenged the rigid structures of society and refused to be defined by the chains imposed upon her. The city of New Orleans still remembers her, not in its official histories, but in its shadows, its hidden rooms, its whispered legends, and the flickering lamplight on cobblestone streets where secrets refuse to die. Prepare yourself to enter the hidden corridors of history, to witness a tale of human suffering and triumph, and to meet Elena Reynolds, the woman whose beauty was legendary, whose mind was unmatched, and whose story is as mysterious, dangerous, and captivating as the city she once called home. To understand Elena Reynolds, one must first understand the world into which she was born, a city of contradictions, a place of extraordinary wealth shadowed by unimaginable cruelty. New Orleans in the early 1800s was a bustling port, a melting pot of cultures, languages, and commerce. French, Spanish, and English influences overlapped in the architecture, the cuisine, and even the legal codes that governed daily life. The streets were alive with the sounds of horse-drawn carriages, the clatter of riverboats docking along the Mississippi, and the calls of merchants selling spices, fabrics, and sugar. Yet beneath this lively surface ran the currents of a far darker reality. Slavery was not just an economic system in New Orleans, it was a social order, a hierarchy woven into the very fabric of the city. The wealth of the elite, their mansions, their fashion, and their elaborate social rituals depended entirely on the labor, suffering, and subjugation of those considered property. The city's economy thrived on the sugar and cotton plantations of Louisiana, on the labor of those chained to the fields, and on the intricate networks of auction houses and traders who commodified human life. In this world, the color of one's skin could dictate whether a person was valued as a member of society or reduced to a mere transaction. For free people of color, life offered limited opportunities and constant scrutiny. Laws and social codes restricted movement, education, and rights, while societal prejudice constrained personal freedom. Even those born into freedom were never truly equal, constantly navigating the shifting boundaries between acceptance and oppression. For enslaved people, the stakes were far higher. Families could be torn apart at a moment's notice, futures stolen in an instant, and identities reshaped to fit the whims of their owners. Every choice, every whispered word, every glance could carry profound consequences. New Orleans' social hierarchy was complex. At the top were wealthy white planters, merchants, and aristocrats, whose wealth often rivaled European nobility. Beneath them were the skilled artisans, shopkeepers, and free people of color, many of whom had achieved relative comfort yet remained subject to discriminatory laws. At the bottom were the enslaved, laborers, domestic servants, and field workers, whose lives were controlled entirely by others. Within this system, beauty, intelligence, and cunning could sometimes shift power, but never erase the chains imposed by race and property. It was within this web of power and oppression that Elena was born. Her father, the disinherited son of a wealthy plantation owner, and her mother, a free woman of color, represented the complicated intersections of class, race, and legitimacy that defined Louisiana society. For Elena, her lineage would be both a curse and a tool. On one hand, a racial classification placed her at the mercy of laws that denied her rights and subjected her to the horrors of slavery. On the other hand, her parentage provided her with latent claims and knowledge that, when discovered, could challenge the very structures that sought to suppress her. The city itself was a stage for these contradictions. During the day, merchants bargained in markets filled with exotic goods and the scent of the river, while overseers patrolled the docks and plantations with whips in hand. By night, the city transformed. Candlelight illuminated the grand salons, where balls and social gatherings were held, attended by the elite who measured status and power in gestures, fashion, and the alliances they formed. Hidden in the alleyways, the sounds of voodoo drums and clandestine gatherings reminded all that beneath the polished surface of New Orleans, another world thrived, one of secrecy, resistance, and survival. Riverboats were the arteries of commerce, carrying goods and people up and down the Mississippi. They also carried whispers of escape, of the Underground Railroad, and of daring attempts at freedom. Many enslaved people risked everything to board these vessels, leaving behind everything they knew for a chance at liberty. And it was against this backdrop of wealth, danger, and constant surveillance that Elela Nena learned to navigate, to observe, and to plan. The legal landscape further complicated life for those of color. Louisiana's civil code, influenced by French and Spanish traditions, treated enslaved and free people differently, creating loopholes and contradictions. Property rights, inheritance laws, and social recognition were often used to control and exploit. Yet they also presented opportunities for those clever enough to understand them. Elela Nena, though young and ostensibly powerless, would learn these systems, how they could be manipulated, and how they could be used to reclaim her freedom when the moment came. In this world, appearances mattered as much as reality. Elegance, poise, and intelligence could serve as armor. A sharp mind and careful observation could turn peril into advantage. And in a society that measured human worth in currency and bloodlines, knowing one's own value and when to assert it was the difference between survival and death. Elela Nena's story would be defined by her ability to navigate this treacherous world. One misstep could cost her everything, but one calculated move could shift her destiny entirely. Understanding this society, the streets, the river, the plantations, the legal codes, and the social hierarchies is essential to grasping the magnitude of Elela Nena's courage. She was not simply a victim of circumstance. She was a woman who existed within a system designed to control her. Yet she found ways to bend it to her will. Every decision she made, every alliance she formed, and every calculated risk she took reflected an acute awareness of the world. Around her, a world both beautiful and brutal, seductive and deadly, that would shape her story in ways unimaginable. Tonight, as we trace her journey from the auction blocks to the grand halls of New Orleans society, from hidden journals to clandestine portraits, remember this: the city she inhabited was more than a backdrop. It was a living, breathing entity, a crucible in which power, beauty, and survival collided. And within it, Elela Nena Reynolds would emerge not merely as a figure of beauty, but as a woman whose intellect, courage, and resilience would defy the boundaries imposed upon her by race, law, and the cruel economics of slavery. To fully comprehend the mystery that surrounds her, we must first walk these streets, understand the currents of power and prejudice, and feel the weight of a society where human beings could be both celebrated and condemned for the same traits. Only then can we begin to unravel the bizarre, haunting, and extraordinary story of the most beautiful slave in New Orleans history. Elela Nena Reynolds was born into a world that had already drawn the lines of her destiny before her first breath. The daughter of a free woman of color and the disinherited son of a wealthy plantation family, she was, by law and by society, a contradiction, a child whose existence defied the rigid hierarchies around her. Her early years were a delicate balance of protection and peril. While her mother ensured that Elela Nena learned the value of knowledge, grace, and observation, the shadows of the wider world loomed over her. Even at home, whispers of inheritance disputes in family, scandals hinted that her life would not follow a simple path. From a young age, she understood that freedom was fragile, and security even more so. In the complex world of Louisiana law, bloodlines and color determined worth. Even a trace of European ancestry could elevate status, while a darker complexion could strip rights away. Elela Nena's very birth forced her into a liminal space, neither fully accepted by the free elite, nor completely enslaved, yet always at risk. Her mother's guidance was her first defense, teaching her how to read people, to notice their intentions, and to measure the power in a look, a tone, a gesture. These lessons would become the foundation of her survival. But the illusion of safety was shattered when she was still a child. Captured under circumstances that remained partially obscured by time, Elela Nena was forced into slavery. The streets of New Orleans, which had once offered a hint of possibility, became arenas of threat and exploitation. She was taken to Beau Refuge, a sprawling plantation notorious for its harsh overseers and relentless labor. The air was thick with the scent of sugarcane and the sweat of human toil. Here, the full brutality of the system revealed itself. As families were torn apart, lives reduced to commodities, and resistance punished with swift and often brutal force. Life on the plantation was regimented and unforgiving. From dawn until dusk, Elena and those enslaved around her labored in the fields under the merciless Louisiana sun. The overseer's whips cracked through the air, a constant reminder that obedience was enforced with pain. Even within the domestic quarters, the pressure was unrelenting. Every movement, every word, every glance could be scrutinized. And yet, within this landscape of oppression, Elena discovered the subtle power of observation. She learned who held influence among the staff, which gods could be reasoned with, and how whispers could be used to her advantage. Her intelligence and beauty, traits that might have been assets in another life, became tools for survival. Elegance, poise, and quick thinking allowed her to navigate interactions with the plantation owners and their guests, moments where a careless word could be fatal. She learned to mask her thoughts, to read intentions, and to identify opportunities to bend the system to her advantage. These skills, honed under constant threat, would later prove crucial in orchestrating her escape and reclaiming her freedom. Yet captivity was never merely physical. It was also psychological. Elena faced the constant erosion of identity, as her very existence was treated as property. The system attempted to strip her of her name, her family history, and her sense of self. In secret, she clung to memories of her mother, the lessons in subtlety and resilience, and the knowledge that she was more than the circumstances into which she had been thrust. Every day she memorized patterns, noted weaknesses, and imagined paths that might one day lead her beyond the confines of Bow Refuge. Amid the labor and fear, there were small acts of rebellion, whispers of hope, and fleeting alliances. Fellow captives became teachers in resilience, sharing stories, strategies, and warnings about the dangers of trust and betrayal. Martha, a seasoned servant mentioned in Elena's journal, became an essential ally, offering guidance and discreet aid. It was these relationships, forged in secrecy and necessity, that provided the scaffolding for what would become her daring escape. Even within the cruel hierarchy of Bow Refuge, moments of humanity surfaced. Elena observed the behaviors of her oppressors, noting inconsistencies and vulnerabilities. She began to map the power dynamics, understanding which individuals could be persuaded, intimidated, or distracted. These observations were not born of innocence, but of survival. Young girl learning to wield knowledge in a world designed to strip her of every tool of power. In her mind, escape was not just an aspiration. It was a strategy, a sequence of calculated steps waiting for the right moment to unfold. Her captivity also exposed the layers of complicity that sustained the institution of slavery. From the wealthy planter who profited without lifting a hand, to the local merchants who facilitated trade in human lives, Elena came to understand the breadth and depth of the system that imprisoned her. Each day reinforced a bitter truth. Freedom could only be claimed by those willing to risk everything, including their lives. And in this crucible, Elena was forged into a figure capable of defying expectations, navigating peril, and ultimately reclaiming what society had denied her by birth. Her story, however, is not merely one of suffering. It is one of meticulous planning, courage, and resilience. Every observation at Bow Refuge, every whispered secret, every small act of defiance, contributed to the intricate web that would allow her to escape. When the riverboats began to carry sugar and goods to distant ports, they also carried whispers of freedom, vessels on which Elena would later stake her daring flight. The path from captivity to agency, from a girl born into contradiction to a woman determined to define her own destiny, had already begun to take shape within the shadowed fields and grand halls of Bow Refuge Plantation. To fully grasp the audacity of her later actions, the secret negotiations, the reappearance in New Orleans society, and the eventual flight to Europe, we must first witness the crucible of her early life. Captivity was not just a backdrop. It was the forge in which Elena's courage, intellect, and strategic brilliance were tempered. It was here, in the interplay of fear and cunning, oppression and insight, that the most beautiful slave in New Orleans, history began to write the first chapters of her own story, in the margins of a world determined to silence her. The night of her escape arrived like a storm, silent, tense, and charged with danger. Elena Reynolds, no longer the girl forced into a life not her own, had transformed her captivity into opportunity. Every lesson learned in the shadows of Bow Refuge, every observation of human behavior, every whispered alliance had culminated in this single, audacious act. She knew the risks, Capture could mean immediate death, punishment, or the permanent loss of any chance at freedom. Yet the fire of self-determination burned brighter than fear. With meticulous precision, she prepared. Hidden among the grain stores and under the cover of darkness, she gathered the few possessions that might sustain her: a small bundle of clothing, a simple dagger, and the pearl earrings left by her mother. These earrings were more than ornamentation. They were currency, leverage, and a tangible connection to the life she was reclaiming. Every step was calculated. The servants who could be trusted had been discreetly informed, the riverboat schedule studied, and potential obstacles mapped in her mind with the clarity of a strategist planning a campaign. The riverboats were central to her plan. These floating vessels carrying sugar and trade goods along the Mississippi also represented a path to freedom. One misstep could send her back into the hands of those who would see her silenced. Elelonena timed her movements to coincide with the unloading of cargo, the lull of the night watch, and the distraction of routine inspections. Her heart pounded with each step, yet her face betrayed nothing. Discipline and instinct had become second nature. Every shadow became an ally. Every distant sound was a signal to pause, to advance, or to retreat. As she approached the dock, the masts of the riverboat rose like silent sentinels against the moonlit sky. Crews were busy with their tasks, unaware that a fugitive walked among them, invisible in plain sight. Elelonena used the tools of her environment: crates to hide behind, the noise of a falling rope to mask movement, and the carefully timed shuffle of feet along the wooden planks. One wrong sound, one misplaced glance, and all would be lost. Yet she moved with the grace and resolve of someone who had learned to make danger bend to her will. Martha, the trusted servant whose loyalty had been proven over years of hardship, provided the final piece of the puzzle with a subtle signal. The boat crew, selected for their discretion, allowed Elelonena to slip aboard unnoticed. The river, dark and wide, seemed to hold its breath as the vessel drifted away from the dock. For the first time in her life, Elelonena felt the intoxicating taste of autonomy, tempered by the ever-present knowledge that pursuit could be swift and merciless. But escape was only the beginning. Her destination was New Orleans, a city where society thrived on appearances, where wealth and lineage determined power, and where she would need to move like a shadow, unseen yet aware. Every street, every alley, every carriage could be a trap. She traveled by night, using aliases and assuming identities that allowed her to blend into the bustling port city. Each interaction was a test. Guards, merchants, and fellow travelers all needed to be assessed quickly, their intentions measured, and potential threats neutralized before they could even arise. Along the way, she faced the complexities of human nature: fear, suspicion, greed, and the occasional spark of kindness. These encounters tested her judgment and honed her instincts further. Each small victory, a bribe accepted, a question deflected, a gesture unnoticed, was a step toward the ultimate goal: freedom and the reclamation of her rightful identity. The Mississippi River, often a symbol of commerce and exploitation, became her lifeline, carrying her away from oppression and toward possibility. Yet even in the midst of flight, Elelonena could not forget the stakes. The legacy of the Delocqua family loomed like a shadow, the promise of inheritance and the threat of retribution entwined. She knew that to survive, she would need more than courage. She would need strategy, patience, and an understanding of the intricate social and legal systems that governed New Orleans. Her escape was a delicate dance, a combination of intuition, timing, and sheer audacity. Every moment required vigilance, every breath measured, every choice calculated. And when at last she reached the city, the veil of anonymity allowed her to begin the next phase of her plan. Her reemergence would not be as a fugitive, but as a player in a game far larger than herself. Elelonena was no longer merely surviving. She was navigating toward influence, toward reclaiming what had been denied to her, and toward reshaping the fate imposed by a society that had attempted to define her from birth. The daring escape of Elelonena Reynolds is not simply a tale of flight from bondage. It is a masterclass in human ingenuity under duress. Each calculated risk, each observation, each act of courage reveals the mind of a young woman who refused to be a victim. The river, the night, the shadows, all became instruments in her pursuit of freedom. And in those quiet, tension-filled moments aboard the riverboat, one can almost feel the pulse of history itself, bearing witness to a woman who dared to reclaim her destiny, step by step, decision by decision, into the unknown. Her journey along the river was both literal and symbolic, a transition from enforced captivity to the uncertain promise of autonomy. With every mile that separated her from Beau Refuge, Elena moved closer to the extraordinary life she would forge, one that would challenge the boundaries of race, gender and class in 19th century New Orleans, and ultimately across the Atlantic. The audacity of her escape set the stage for the remarkable events yet to unfold, where strategy, courage, and the indomitable human spirit would converge to create one of the most compelling stories in American history. Elena Reynolds stepped into New Orleans, not as the frightened girl sold at auction, not as property to be bartered, but as a woman transformed by experience, strategy, and survival. The city's streets, narrow and bustling with merchants, sailors and socialites, were alive with commerce and intrigue, a stage upon which she would perform her most daring act yet, not simply to survive, but to assert her presence in a world that had sought to erase her existence. The society of New Orleans was rigid, a delicate lattice of wealth, lineage, and racial expectation. Every carriage, every powdered wig, every fluttering gown signaled status, power, and the subtle rules of inclusion and exclusion. Here, appearances mattered more than truth, and secrets were currency. For Elena, navigating this labyrinth required not only caution, but cunning. She understood the stakes. A single misstep could expose her origins, undo the delicate network of her escape, and return her to the chains she had fought so desperately to leave behind. Her first nights in the city were a dance of observation and calculation. She moved through shadowed alleys and lantern-lit streets, blending with servants, merchants, and travelers. Every interaction was a test. Questions were deflected with charm, curiosity redirected with subtlety, and every potential threat was weighed before trust was extended. She relied upon the network of allies cultivated during her time on the plantation and along the river, including the loyal Martha Bernard, whose knowledge of the city and its undercurrents proved invaluable. But New Orleans was not merely a backdrop for survival. It was a theater for transformation. Elena needed more than anonymity. She needed influence, leverage, and the means to secure her freedom in a society structured to deny it. Her intelligence, cultivated through years of observing the world around her, became her greatest weapon. She learned the habits of merchants, the vulnerabilities of aristocrats, and the secrets whispered in the gilded halls of power. Each secret she uncovered was a stepping stone toward agency and autonomy. It was at the St. Louis Hotel, a place of grandeur and spectacle, where her presence would first shock the city into awareness. The annual Mardi Gras ball, a swirl of silk gowns, powdered faces, and gilded masks, was a symbol of New Orleans' social hierarchy. And there Elena emerged, no longer hidden in shadows, but adorned in a gown of midnight, blue silk that accentuated her extraordinary poise and striking features. She entered on the arm of Louis Villers, the heir to the Villers fortune, transforming her return into an event that would reverberate through the whispers and glances of the city's elite. Eyes turned, conversations ceased, and the room seemed to contract around her presence. Attendees who had been present at auctions and transactions years prior recognized, with silent shock, the girl they once saw sold as property. Yet the unspoken truth of her transformation, her freedom, her power, her alliance with Louis created a tension that could not be voiced aloud. It was in these moments that Elena wielded influence not through force, but through audacity, intellect, and the quiet authority of survival. The reactions were varied. Some regarded her with awe, others with suspicion, and a few, like Charles Delacroix, were consumed with fear and indignation. His attempted approach toward her was halted by friends, a silent acknowledgement that the balance of power had shifted. And within that shifting dynamic, Elena quietly secured her place, not as a pawn, but as a player who understood the rules, the stakes, and the consequences. The social sphere of New Orleans, long a cage, had now become a chessboard on which she could maneuver. Beyond the spectacle, her movements in New Orleans were strategic. Meetings were arranged with lawyers, discreet agents, and loyal intermediaries to gather documents, proving her parentage and rightful claims. Each step forward required negotiation, persuasion, and the careful orchestration of appearances. Even the smallest miscalculation could unravel the delicate tapestry she had woven. A misstep could expose her, risk the return of her captors, or draw unwanted attention to her alliances. And yet, Elena moved with a calm authority, a reflection of the years of hardship and observation that had honed her instincts. She had learned that power in New Orleans was often subtle, a matter of perception as much as law, of influence as much as evidence. Her alliances were carefully chosen, her words measured, and her appearance, a combination of elegance, restraint, and subtle defiance, became her armor. Her reemergence was more than a personal triumph. It was a statement to the city itself. Here was a woman who had been sold as property, who had survived the river, the plantations, and the constant threat of violence, who now walked freely among the elite, commanding attention without uttering a single word of challenge. Her presence redefined expectations, disrupted social assumptions, and signaled that the rules of power could be rewritten by those bold enough to seize opportunity. In the weeks that followed, Elena and Luis Villar's alliance continued to unfold with precision. Legal claims were addressed, settlements quietly arranged, and the city's whispers grew louder. The stakes were not only social, they were legal, financial, and deeply personal. Each encounter, each discreet transaction, each carefully timed appearance reinforced the narrative she had crafted. A woman who had survived, who understood the power of subtlety, and who could navigate a society designed to suppress her at every turn, through her audacity, intelligence, and relentless pursuit of agency. Elena Reynolds transformed the very environment that had once sought to contain her. She had escaped the auction block, the plantation, and the river, but it was in New Orleans, among whispers, silk gowns, and gilded masks, that she truly began to reclaim her identity, her legacy, and her freedom. Her story, though deeply personal, serves as a mirror to the city itself, a place where power race and survival intertwine, where appearances deceive, and where the bold can sometimes carve out a space for justice and autonomy, even in the most oppressive of circumstances. Elena's reemergence in New Orleans is not merely an episode of survival. It is a testament to the ingenuity, courage, and strategic brilliance required to challenge an unjust world, and to the extraordinary lengths one woman went to write her own destiny. Behind the grand facades of New Orleans mansions, where chandeliers sparkled and socialites whispered in hushed tones, lay secrets darker than the shadows cast by gas lamps. Elena Reynolds' story was no longer just about survival. It had become a delicate balance of power. Inheritance and vengeance entwined with the fates of families who had sought to claim, control, or silence her. The Delocroix estate, a sprawling property on Royal Street, was more than a home. It was a symbol of wealth, influence, and entitlement. For years, its owners had operated under the assumption that ownership, bloodline, and status granted them unquestionable authority. And for years, Elena's existence had been invisible to the city's elite, an inconvenient fact easily overlooked. Yet the hidden truths of her lineage, the papers, and her mother's legacy threatened to disrupt the carefully maintained social and financial hierarchy. Her claim to inheritance was not merely symbolic. It carried the potential to upend fortunes, reputations, and the fragile balance of power. The strategy she employed was as precise as it was daring. Every step toward reclaiming her rights was measured against the risk of exposure. Documents proving her connection to the Villar family were scattered and concealed, and Elena relied upon loyal intermediaries like Martha Bernard, who knew the city's undercurrents and could navigate its clandestine networks. These small, deliberate acts of preparation allowed her to operate within a society that would have otherwise crushed her with the weight of legal, social, and racial restrictions. Meanwhile, the Delocroix family, unaware of the depth of Elena's intelligence and resourcefulness, moved forward with their own ambitions, seeking to consolidate their wealth and maintain social dominance. Charles Delocroix, increasingly desperate and paranoid, became a looming threat. His fixation on the property and its perceived rightful ownership led him down a path of recklessness, blind to the web of planning that Elena and her allies had already woven. As tensions rose, Elena orchestrated her reemergence into society with remarkable timing. Her appearance at the St. Louis Hotel's Mardi Gras ball was more than spectacle. It was calculated leverage. Each whispered glance, each stunned pause, each conversation that faltered upon her entrance sent ripples of unease through those who once considered her powerless. She had transformed perception itself into a tool, using society's obsession with appearances to cloak her moves, manipulate attention, and subtly assert influence over powerful figures like Louis Villars and, unknowingly, Charles Delocroix. The subsequent days were a silent storm. Elena and Louis Villars coordinated behind the scenes, navigating legal nuances, securing settlements, and positioning themselves for what history would later reveal as a final, decisive act. The disappearance of the Delocroix family was no coincidence, nor a spontaneous crime of passion. The meticulous elimination of witnesses, the secretary and plantation manager pointed to careful planning, an understanding of human and social behavior. and a willingness to act decisively when survival and justice converged. Yet amidst the strategy and maneuvering, Elelenena's humanity remained visible in the small mercies she orchestrated. The Delokwa children, separated from their parents before the killings, were spared from the brutal consequences that fell upon the adults, who had sought to enslave or control her. Their safe passage to Cuba, overseen by trusted intermediaries, reflected a moral complexity that was extraordinary for the era. A recognition that while retribution might be necessary, innocence should remain untouched. It was an act that highlighted not only her strategic brilliance but also the depth of her empathy and understanding of the human cost of vengeance. In this period, New Orleans became a city of silent observers. Gossip mingled with fear, as rumors of missing families, sudden disappearances, and mysterious wealth circulated quietly among elite salons and shadowed alleys. Elelenena's movements were calculated to remain just beyond the reach of suspicion, yet sufficiently influential to ensure her freedom and security. Every decision, from alliances, formed to appearances, made, was part of a meticulous plan to reclaim agency in a world designed to deny it. The hidden inheritance was not merely a matter of property. It was a symbol of identity, autonomy, and survival. The papers, portraits, and journals Elelenena sought were threads connecting her to a history that powerful men had tried to rewrite or erase. By retrieving, preserving, and ultimately leveraging this evidence, she asserted not only her legal rights but her narrative. History, which had once reduced her to a commodity, now had to reckon with her as a person of intellect, influence, and will. The Delokwa disappearance remains one of the most chilling and enigmatic events in New Orleans history. Bodies disposed of, houses abandoned with eerie precision, and a trail of whispers and conjecture. These were not random acts. They were the outcome of a collision between institutionalized oppression, calculated survival, and the moral ambiguities of those forced to operate outside the law to reclaim their lives. For Elelenena, each choice reflected the weight of centuries of injustice, the necessity of secrecy, and the determination to define her own destiny in a society that sought to define it for her. In retrospect, the events that unfolded at the Delokwa mansion were a turning point. They demonstrated the power of knowledge, strategy, and alliances in a city where social standing and racial categorization determined fate. Elelenena's actions, while controversial and morally complex, ensured her continued freedom, preserved the lives of the innocent, and altered the trajectory of inheritance, wealth, and reputation in New Orleans society. They serve as a stark reminder of the lengths to which a person must go when legal systems fail, when morality is contested, and when survival demands both cunning and courage. The hidden inheritance, the secret letters, the vanished family, these mysteries converged to create a narrative as intricate as it was terrifying. Elelenena Reynolds' life was no longer defined solely by captivity, but by her audacity, her intellect, and her unflinching determination to navigate a world stacked against her. The Delokwa disappearance, the concealment of evidence, and the strategic orchestration of events reveal a woman who understood that to claim her freedom fully, she had to control not only her actions, but the perception of those around her. In doing so, she redefined the boundaries of power, justice, and identity in a city, built upon secrets and shadowed by the consequences of human cruelty. Her story reminds us that in a society structured to suppress, control, and commodify, survival requires more than strength. It requires strategy, intellect, and sometimes a willingness to confront the darkest realities of human behavior. Elelenena's calculated reemergence, the retrieval of her rightful inheritance, and the orchestration of the Delokwa resolution stand as a testament to her extraordinary resourcefulness and unyielding resolve. Through these acts, she not only reclaimed her freedom, but also asserted her narrative, ensuring that history could no longer dictate her identity without her consent. By February 1842, Elelenena Reynolds had transformed from a fugitive into a figure of calculated agency. The streets of New Orleans, once a landscape of constraint and surveillance, now bore witness to her strategic departure. Boarding a steamship bound for France, she left behind the city that had both confined and defined her, carrying with her only the essentials of survival, the knowledge of her lineage, and the careful arrangements she had orchestrated to safeguard those she could not fully rescue. The journey across the Atlantic was more than a physical relocation. It was a symbolic severing of chains. Each passing wave echoed the centuries of subjugation she had endured, while the vast, open waters represented possibilities, unbounded by the racial and social hierarchies of her homeland. Elelenena's travels with Louis Villars who now acted as her partner both in life and in strategy, reflected a subtle yet undeniable assertion of equality, freedom, and control over their shared destiny. Settling in France, they adopted identities that allowed them to blend into society without the constant threat of surveillance or retribution. Paris, with its cosmopolitan air and relative racial fluidity, offered a reprieve from the rigid classifications and legal systems that had dictated Elena's early life. Here, she could exist as a person rather than a commodity, an individual whose lineage, intellect, and determination commanded respect rather than servitude. Life in Europe provided a stark contrast to the oppressive environment of New Orleans. Letters discovered decades later, written by Elena herself, reveal a woman who found both comfort and purpose in this new chapter. She and Louis married, raising 3 children in households far removed from the trauma of the American South. Their children, shielded from the legacy of slavery and the brutal inheritance disputes, grew up with the opportunity to define their own lives, unaware of the complexities that had shaped their mother's early existence. Yet, Elena's European existence was not free from echoes of the past. Recurring nightmares and the moral weight of the decisions that led to the Delacroix disappearance haunted her reflections. Letters referenced the lingering question of the Delacroix children's fate, an ambiguity that weighed heavily on her conscience. Even in freedom, the shadows of survival, retribution, and responsibility remained inextricable from her identity. Her experience was a testament to the paradox of liberation. Escape from oppression did not erase the scars of injustice or the memory of moral complexity. Her legacy in Europe was quietly monumental. Through careful preservation of documents, portraits, and correspondence, she ensured that the truth of her lineage, her intellect, and her struggle would not be lost. The portrait she commissioned, or perhaps painted herself, revealed both her elegance and her resilience, concealing layers of identity that echoed her own intricate life story. Beneath the visible image of a poised woman lay the subtle imprint of her family, her ancestry, and the silent assertion of rights that had once been denied. In London, Elena lived out her remaining years in relative anonymity, yet with dignity and community. Her funeral, attended by friends and acquaintances, reflected the impact she had quietly made upon those who knew her. Though the wider world remained largely unaware of the depth of her past struggles, within her household and her social circle, she had carved out a space defined by autonomy, respect, and family continuity. Her children went on to integrate into respectable English society, the story of their mother's extraordinary journey largely unknown to them, yet shaping their lives in profound, invisible ways. Back in New Orleans, the echoes of Elena's choices continued to resonate. The Delacroix mansion, abandoned and later transformed into a historic hotel, preserved the memory of the events that had unfolded within its walls. Visitors, unaware of the layers of history hidden beneath, its polished floors and preserved rooms, occasionally reported unusual phenomena, footsteps, the subtle movement of objects, and a sense of presence lingering in the shadows. These occurrences, whether supernatural or psychological, serve as a reminder that the past, though obscured, continues to inhabit the spaces it once shaped. The artifacts she left behind, the portrait, the gold locket, and the journal, stand as silent witnesses to a life that defied the rigid constraints of her time. They encapsulate a journey from captivity to self-determination, from anonymity to legacy, and from enforced invisibility to an enduring, tangible presence within history. Through them, Elena asserted control over her narrative, transforming it from one of oppression to one of resilience, strategy, and ultimate triumph. Elena Reynolds' life in Europe and her final legacy are not merely historical footnotes. They are profound illustrations of human agency, the pursuit of freedom, and the intricate navigation of moral, social, and racial boundaries. Her story challenges us to consider the ways in which history often obscures the contributions, struggles, and victories of those who lived in the margins, and to acknowledge the courage required to reclaim one's narrative against systems designed to deny it. Ultimately, her escape and life abroad demonstrate that liberation, in its truest sense, encompasses more than physical freedom. It is the reclamation of identity, the safeguarding of justice where the law fails, and the creation of a legacy that honors both survival and principle. Elena's European chapter, though far from the streets of New Orleans where her trials began, represents the culmination of a lifetime of ingenuity, endurance, and moral fortitude, a testament to a woman who refused to be defined by the chains imposed upon her. As we reflect on Elena Reynolds' final chapter, we are reminded that the echoes of her choices persist, not only in the preserved artifacts and documented letters, but in the broader understanding of resistance, agency, and the human capacity to navigate and transcend injustice. Her story, though anchored in the specific horrors and constraints of 19th century America, resonates across time as a symbol of determination, resilience, and the enduring quest for freedom. Long after Elena Reynolds Villiers passed away in London, her story continued to ripple across time, across continents and across generations. The woman who had once walked the auction blocks of New Orleans, whose beauty and intelligence had been commodified alongside her body, had transformed herself into a symbol of resilience, strategy, and self-determination. Her life was not just a personal triumph. It became an enduring commentary on the human cost of a society built upon slavery, race, and inheritance disputes. Today, the artifacts she left behind, her journal, the meticulously preserved portrait, the hidden family painting beneath it, and the gold locket linking her to her lineage, reside in the historic New Orleans collection. These objects do more than commemorate her existence. They are evidence of a life lived with intention, a narrative carefully controlled against the odds, and a rebellion against the systems that sought to erase her. Through them, she communicates across centuries, whispering truths about identity, freedom, and justice that history often prefers to conceal. The story of Elena is also inseparable from the haunted echoes of the spaces she once inhabited. The Delocqua mansion on Royal Street, where the final acts of violence, strategy, and mercy unfolded, stands today as a historic site and small hotel. Guests report footsteps echoing in empty hallways, the subtle shifting of objects, and an uncanny sensation of being watched. Whether these are manifestations of restless spirits or the power of suggestion in a city steeped in legend, they act as spectral reminders of the turbulent lives once lived within those walls. Yet her legacy is more than folklore. In recent decades, descendants of the Villiers family have established a scholarship fund for African-American students pursuing law, named in Elena Reynolds' honor. The creation of this fund, accompanied by a formal acknowledgement of her rightful place in the family lineage, represents a rare institutional recognition of the injustice she endured and the agency she asserted. It is a symbolic reclamation of what was denied to her in life. Recognition, justice, and acknowledgement of her humanity. The mystery of the pearl, the symbol around which her story crystallizes, remains unresolved. What became of the Delocqua children, who vanished into Cuba and possibly further abroad, remains unknown. The precise methods by which Louis Villard executed the elimination of threats while preserving the children's safety continue to provoke both fascination and moral reflection. The story, in its complexity, underscores that historical truth is rarely absolute, often layered with moral ambiguity, and frequently dependent on fragments of surviving evidence, letters, ship manifests, confessions, and portraits. Elena's life challenges the modern observer to reconcile beauty, power, and suffering. Her amber eyes, captured in the portrait that hangs silently in the museum, seem to look past the viewer, to a horizon beyond the visible where freedom, justice, and self-determination converge. In them one sees both the scars of enslavement and the unyielding determination to exist on her own terms. The portrait, perhaps painted over her family's image by her own hand, serves as both concealment and reclamation, a layered metaphor for identity, legacy, and the subtle, unrecorded acts of defiance that define a life lived against oppression. The broader significance of Elena Reynolds' story lies not only in her individual triumphs, but in the countless unnamed lives intertwined with hers. For every documented victory, there were thousands of others whose struggles, pain, and ingenuity were never recorded. The anonymity of these lives forms the backdrop against which her story shines, a rare instance in which agency, intellect, and courage were preserved for posterity. Her journey from auction block to European drawing rooms represents an extraordinary assertion of selfhood in a world designed to strip it away. Elena's tale is at its core a meditation on justice, morality, and the human spirit. It is a reminder that in a society structured by commodification and hierarchy, the reclamation of one's narrative is itself an act of defiance. Her actions, whether the careful planning of escapes, the safeguarding of children, or the reclamation of her family's likeness, reflect a sophisticated negotiation of ethics, survival, and retribution. She navigated a world in which legal protection was denied, yet she managed to carve out a domain of personal justice, moral agency, and enduring influence. As visitors stand before her portrait, They confront not only the image of a remarkable woman, but the layered history of a city and a society built on slavery, secrecy, and social stratification. Her life reminds us that identity, freedom, and legacy are rarely granted. They must be claimed, defended, and sometimes fiercely protected. The story of Elena Reynolds persists as a challenge to modern audiences. To acknowledge the hidden histories, to confront moral ambiguities, and to recognize the extraordinary resilience that emerges when the human spirit refuses to be confined. In the end, the bizarre mystery of the pearl is not just about a single woman, a hidden journal, or a lost family. It is a meditation on the enduring struggle for autonomy, the collision between cruelty and courage, and the lengths to which one must go to claim a life of dignity. Elena Reynolds wrote herself into history, not merely as a survivor of slavery, but as an architect of her destiny, a woman who refused to accept the role assigned to her, and whose legacy continues to echo across centuries, across oceans, and across the invisible lines that separate oppression from freedom. Her story, preserved in artifacts, letters, and the faint whispers of legend, urges us to listen, to remember, and to reckon with the realities of the past. The pearl, enigmatic and haunting, remains both symbol and witness, a testament to human resilience, the intricacies of justice, and the relentless pursuit of selfhood. And as the sun sets over the Mississippi, as the air fills with the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of riverboats, one can almost hear the echoes of Elena's journey, a reminder that while history may attempt to silence, courage and determination can, and often do, transcend the boundaries imposed upon them. So remember her not only for her beauty, nor for her suffering, but for her indomitable will to exist on her own terms. In a world that sought to deny her that right, she wrote herself into being, and in doing so, left a story that challenges, inspires, and refuses to fade with time.